right, we are going to get started. I want to do a shout out to the Richmond Community High School students. Thank you for being here and joining us today and being a part of this seminar. This is a seminar that is sponsored by the Environmental Studies program. It is the Global Environmental Speaker Series, and we have different programs, seminars that are offered all the time. We have one tomorrow, which unfortunately you won't be here. We'll be on energy, and we have different things that go on throughout the semester. Oh, are you trying to? Oh, it's still coming from there though, right? Okay. Try not to be very crunchy chewing in front of that though. So there's a lot that's going on at the university, and we're happy to have a lot of our students here and some faculty, and then the high school students as well. So some of you got to hear Dr. Monfort speak yesterday at the biology seminar, and that primarily was about a lot of his reproductive physiology and conservation work that he's done. Some of you were also in attendance for the career kind of talk. Some of you even had an opportunity to meet with him personally today as well. So Dr. Monfort has been talking a lot over the last 2 days, and so hopefully he can get through this hour without losing his voice. But I've known Dr. Monfort now for, and I keep calling him Steve, so I'm going to call him Steve, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So I've known Steve for 20 or so years now, so friends, colleagues. He's my former boss at the Smithsonian. He was at the Smithsonian for 35 years, and during that time he went from a research scientist having an endocrinology lab to culminating in being the director of the National Zoo and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, with 450 employees, $100 million a year budget. He's traveled all over the world, has close to 200 publications, has really been an inspiration and mentor for a number of people, including Juan, as one of them. Not to say we always agreed on everything, because we didn't, but we had a great relationship. And now, since 2021, he has taken on a new role, and that is being the executive director of the University of California Natural Reserve System. And so his talk today is going to be more about the Sentinel Sites that he's working on, and the cross between kind of climate change and biodiversity and environmental sensors and different things. So it's a little bit of a different talk. But when we get to the question part, feel free to ask questions about anything that we get to. And with that, Dr. Monfort.
All right. Great, thank you. She was a pain in my neck sometimes, but a good one. A good pain sometimes, too. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I've had a great visit in the last couple of days. I've gotten to meet with really tremendous folks here, faculty and students. It really has been great. I love the idea that people are thinking about the future and what they want to do. And the world's changing so rapidly with respect to the nature space and opportunities that exist there. So hope maybe some ideas will get sparked for you today. So I'm going to give you an overview of the Natural Reserve System first. Then I'm going to talk about how we're using our Natural Reserve System as a Sentinel Site network. So hopefully at the end of this, you'll understand what I mean when I say that. First of all, let's just talk about this. This is a pretty, so I'm going to talk about California. And for those of you, it's a big state. And it's also a state that's under a lot of environmental threats. All these red dots are fires that occurred in 2020. And all of this is smoke across the entire state. So in this particular instance, there were 12,000 lightning strikes over a 3-day period that started 650 wildfires at one time. So this was an incredible example of how climate change and nature have really created the conditions for this kind of catastrophic event that's really bad for people, but also bad for nature. So California happens to be a great example, I think, to look at. But let me talk about, first of all, the University of California. That is the largest academic system in the world. It's consisting of 10 university campuses, 3 national laboratories, 6 health systems. So it's a massive enterprise across the entire state of California. And so I represent this one little part of it, which is the UC Natural Reserve System. And so we have these sites that are set up around the state. I'll show you a map, but this would be an example of one of our facilities that has housing, for faculty or students. These would be like field station conditions. And folks can come in this site and do research either on our site or around the site. So sometimes you think of them as field stations and not so much as big parks. Some of them are quite large, but really they're for deploying scientists and students around vast areas that surround our field stations and allow people to study pretty much every ecosystem in the state of California. So, turn back the clock, the 1950s, even to the 1930s, there was Joseph Grinnell at the University of California, Berkeley. He founded the vertebrate zoology laboratory there, and he described the life history of much of California. And there was a recognition that development and change was rapidly occurring, and there was a need to set aside field stations and places where we could take students for teaching and to do research. But really the momentum for creating a reserve system was in the late 50s. One of our faculty was studying desert iguana here in the Palm Desert, and you can see it's pretty, just basically there's a little bit of development here. But he saw this development encroaching, and it was taking over and basically his field site. He was going to lose his research. So he got together with other faculty and ultimately convinced the president of our university system that there needed to be a reserve system established. So formally in 1965, the Natural Reserve System was established. But he was right. You can see, look at this development. The entire Coachella Valley in California has been fully developed. And so this is a trend that occurred just not recently, but a long time ago, and the reserve system was a response to that. So that was 1965. If you fast forward here, you can see that the world has changed an awful lot with respect to temperature. We've gotten a lot hotter, for example, and just in 2023, in the month of July, it was the hottest surface temperatures that were ever recorded. So we have now the hottest sea level temperature, or sea temperatures, surface temperatures also. So clearly something's going on here in the environment, and that has consequences for nature. So this is also a change that's occurred just in the last 50 years. You could think 1970, we've lost half of all of the mammal species, vertebrate species that on Earth. And, we look at the World Wildlife Fund, does something called the Living Planet Index. It's declined dramatically. So there's a crisis. People have said it's code red for humanity. And if you think of California, you look at these red spots, all of these are where there's imperiled biodiversity. So California has the most biodiversity in the state, or in the United States, but it also has the most imperiled biodiversity. So it is really a kind of a roadmap of what's to come, and we're trying to address it at a scale that matters. This is one of our field stations, actually. It's a high altitude research station called White Mountain. Excuse me. And our mission here is really to understand and steward nature, for the benefit of humanity, but we express that through teaching, research, and public service. So that's our simple mission. And this is where this shows a map. This just shows all the different, these blue dots are the different field stations that exist around the state. We're up to 42. They're called reserves. I think it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's really, as I mentioned, field stations, because we have properties that are inside of national parks that are field stations through 6 different federal partnerships. We have 2 state park field stations, and we actually own a relatively small amount of land, 50,000 acres that we own outright, but that land gives us access to about 2 million acres of partnership lands, and through special agreements and arrangements, our scientists can then deploy and cover really broad landscapes throughout their work. And some of these are like, this is Big Sur, some of the most beautiful coastline that you've ever seen. Here's La Jolla in San Diego, outside of Davis in California. White Mountain, this is at the highest altitude of about 13,200 feet. So we have everything, every ecosystem in the state of California is represented within our system. We generally have more than one replicate of each of those systems. So, it's a pretty cool thing. When I came into the job, I was looking around and trying to understand what was our value proposition? What could we really do with these assets? And traditionally, we had been kind of based on each campus had identified their own set of reserves because the campuses, the 9 UC campuses that have undergraduates, they actually manage the reserves day to day. And they were saying things like, it's the UC Berkeley reserves and it's UC Davis reserves. But I was brought in to sort of talk about how do we function as a system? How could be the University of California system? And I looked at our distribution of sites, and if you tried to replicate this today, it would be impossible. So we have something that's really irreplaceable in terms of physical assets, and the question is, how are we going to use those assets? So California is a pretty cool place. I was born and raised there. I spent 35 years in Virginia, living in Warrenton and working at the National Zoo and the Smithsonian. But only 4% of the land area, and we have 30% of the plant vertebrate species. Also, as I mentioned, a high number of threatened species. And these are the types of challenges that we face on a regular basis. I'm sure in the news you watch, you probably think we're on fire all the time. And we pretty much are. We've had 5 of our reserves that burned since 2020. So it's a reality of our life. And we think that climate is driving much of this change. People can argue about climate. I can talk to you about whether or not it's climate, but we can see drought. And that drives wildfires. Vegetation gets dry. All of this creates habitat change and ultimately loss of biodiversity. And just for those of you who might not know what biodiversity means or is, it's a shortened phrase for biological diversity. And simply what it is it reflects all life on Earth. And you and I are part of biodiversity. Biodiversity are the things that provide us with clean air and water and food and fuel and fiber. And so these are things that we don't necessarily associate with nature, but if you think about it, the forest, the water purification, the air purification, things of this nature, it's essential. And if you have a collapse of biodiversity, then you're going to have a loss of our ability to survive and thrive as a civilization. So that's not really being too dramatic, but the twin threats we talk about are climate change and then the associated loss of biodiversity. It's estimated that about 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction, and that's a problem for humanity. We in our reserves, these are the types of species that we have. We have a high representation of plants and animals that are within our reserve boundaries, so people can come in and do long-term studies that are relatively protected. So if you think about it, if you try to do a long-term study and you put up instruments in a national park, you might be challenged to not have it be disturbed or have your data be interrupted. And so having a place where some of that can be done long-term, even for decades, where you can be assured that you have some protection, that's what we offer. So we have this great representation of systems, animals, and plants. And then we talk about ourselves as being these living laboratories. But basically, these are really the outdoor classrooms that we utilize to help young people, to help students, all the way up from K through 12 to postgraduate students, really explore their interest in nature and to conduct research. Our faculty also build their careers on some of these reserves and have done studies that could be 20, 30 years long. So these are amazing places where you can do long-term protected research in a laboratory context. I put this up to show you some of the types of research that we do at the system. And when we started in 1965, that was when, for those of you who are familiar with, there was something called the Keeling curve. This was the first time that we started measuring in a systematic way carbon dioxide on the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. And this came out of Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And ever since then, if you see a CO2 curve, it's called the Keeling curve, which is named after Charles Keeling. That was established in about 1959, 60, and so we were established in 65. So nobody was thinking about climate change at this particular time. Some may have, people at Scripps were, but generally speaking, nobody was using the term, nobody was really worried about it. They were just thinking about development and human encroachment and so on. So this was the motivation. So people were discovering new species of plants and discovering the life history strategy and studying basic descriptive biology. And so that now, the majority of research that goes on is about how climate is driving change in the environment and ultimately how that's impacting on things like biodiversity and the way that ecosystems function. So this is also the place where we used to teach. And it's an incredibly powerful thing to take a student who has not been exposed to nature out into nature for the first time and help them understand the process of discovery, of developing a hypothesis, of collecting data, for example. So we have lots of different courses, but our field courses, the ones that take you out for weekend trips, even for freshmen that come in, some famous courses, we've got Bio 82 out of Santa Cruz and so on. These are kind of experiences that change people's lives, and I don't say that dramatically. It's just that if you've never had the chance to get your hands out in nature and understand and appreciate it and be guided and mentored in that process, it's phenomenal. And so we've actually done research that has shown that creating this kind of opportunity for students, it makes you be feeling like you're part of a team. So this idea of team-based learning, you want to demystify the science. The kind of school that you have here does a great job of allowing students to feel like they have a close relationship with their faculty, but this isn't typical everywhere. So getting out in the field, it changes the dynamic. We know that it increases GPA, retention rates, and actually graduation rates. So it's pretty amazing. We do about 300 courses a year in total that are run through our reserves, but it's not just open to us. So University of California is here, but our reserves are open to anyone. So anyone here could put in an application on our online application service and just apply to go work at any reserve. And if you have a legitimate reason to do that, you'd be accepted to do it. So we're open really to the world, but predominantly most of our courses are done, as it shows here, from the University of California. We also, as public service, is part of our mission. So this idea of engaging with the communities in which we live and work is really important, and it's something that we've not done a great job with historically. I think that science has been often conducted behind closed gates and in ways that were not accessible to people. And we have 42 of these properties, and in many cases, we're the only face of UC that anybody sees. They're not near a campus or a university. So it's incumbent upon us to be good stewards of our land, but also good partners with the communities. And that means things like helping with K through 12 programming, getting young people out to the reserves. That's not something that we necessarily have core funding for, but we're open to it. We're trying to support it. We're getting people that want to come and volunteer and work with us because we want the community to understand what we do, and it uplifts us if we can uplift them. And also, just understanding how to be a good steward of land. And we have all of this problem with fires in California, and that's due to management issues that over the last 100 years of suppressing fire constantly, and what it's allowed the trees to just grow at much, much higher densities than historically would have been normal. And so the idea of now doing prescribed burning, things that our indigenous tribes did for time immemorial, would be burning for their own benefit, because after you burn, you get the growth of new forbs and herbs and things that they would harvest. And this would cut the fuel load down. So we're working in communities to do good stewardship practices, including burning. We're really pretty widely distributed. There's 58 counties in California, and we represent 28 of those. So it really is, I think, we're ambassadors for the university in that way. We do this, we've done a lot of trying to, California is a very diverse state, and in places like the Central Valley of California, which is an agricultural community, UC Merced is around 60%, Hispanic population, usually first generation, first to go to college. And so it's many of these students would come from families that wouldn't necessarily provide access to nature. Like even for me, when I was growing up, my father wasn't an outdoors person. We didn't hunt or fish or do these things. And so even for me, going into my experience in nature was somewhat limited. And so what we've tried to do here at Merced, we have a program called Field Curious, and we're trying to get every first-year student for an overnight experience in Yosemite National Park in their first year. And the goal is not to make them into scientists, but we give them a backpack and sunscreen and a hat and so on, and they go out and they get a little taste of what it's like to be in nature. The idea is to just increase the sense of belonging, the sense of agency, like I belong here. And even if I didn't know that I belonged here before, now I do. And we hope that it will stimulate people to think of opportunities where nature can be centered in their life in some way. We're not trying to create scientists and ecologists for everything that we do, but we want people to understand the intrinsic value that nature brings and the benefits that we derive from it. So really, it's just about a feeling like you belong. And oftentimes, these students go out in nature, they don't see people like themselves there. And we're trying to break that down. It shouldn't be something that's exclusive for anyone. So that's a really cool program. It's just developing. We're up to about 500 undergrads this year, and next year we're hoping to have all undergrads at UC Merced do that. This could be replicated, by the way, anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We have the curriculum. We'd be happy to share it with anybody. It's an amazing, successful program. Also, we have a really strong community college system in California. So we have the University of California, which is 10 campuses. We have 23 California State University campuses, more like San Diego State, San Jose State, those. And then you have community colleges, and that number is in the hundreds. And so what we're trying to find are pathways that people can enter into the community college system and make the transition into a UC or a CSU without feeling like they've lost a step. I mean, it's pretty intimidating. You're going to go from a community college for 2 years and jump into UC Santa Barbara, let's say. And you might feel like those students have an advantage over you. So what we're trying to do is get students using field experience and this idea of breaking down barriers and increasing agency in nature so that when they make that transfer, they have the confidence, they know how to go and approach somebody, they're not intimidated as much as you would be. So this has been a really successful program. We do it about 9 years, and we've had a couple hundred students. We've tracked them through, so we know it's extremely impactful. And so obviously I'm sort of leaning into this idea of experiential learning. This is not in a classroom. This is not something you can simulate in a classroom. And I do worry that artificial intelligence and so on is really sort of giving us this false sense of how we can control nature and how we can sort of artificially recreate nature. But honestly, this is amazing. There's no substitute for it, and we need to take care of it. So we're trying to encourage undergrads that come through. This is a course that we have. It's our only system-wide course, so meaning that all the 9 campuses, any student from those 9 campuses within the UC can sign up, and their credits get validated for that campus, and so they can spend an entire semester in visiting 7 weeks, and they visit all on field reserves. Most of their time is spent in tents, and basically they have to do a research project, make presentations, work as part of a team. So it's an incredibly impactful program as well. Let's see. One thing that's unique to us is, as the University of California, something called the trustee agency responsibility. And what that really just means is, along with 3 other state agencies, we're the only other group that has a legal responsibility as a trustee of this land to steward it for the benefit of the citizens of California. So that's a pretty, that's a strong responsibility. We take that seriously. So it's not just a place where we can go in and do whatever we want. We want it to be beneficial for everybody in California. Another really important area of work that we do everywhere that we are living and working on the lands of indigenous people that preceded us. And so this in California is quite at the top and forefront of the government's actions to try to give land back to tribal nations that don't have land, for example. These people there were genocides committed, multiple genocides in California over the years, from Spanish to Mexican to people moving out for the gold rush and so on. Just a terrible legacy, and we're trying to correct this in some ways. And this idea of in our lands or other public lands is creating opportunities for co-stewardship of cultural resources, for example. Not necessarily management of our land, but if the state parks and the national park systems are having these agreements with tribes that allow them to come in, and they are allowed to have control over mapping cultural assets and making sure that hiking trails and things are not going to disturb important cultural areas, and that signage is appropriate and the storytelling is done through the eyes of tribal members and not basically people like me. So we've just begun the process in the last year of, as a system, the largest system of its kind in the world, trying to articulate how we would go about forming these relationships, how would you go about making an agreement, and also this is about co-stewardship, it's about providing access to the land for traditional practices, and it's about repatriation of cultural objects, but it's also reburial. And so when remains are found on our land or other lands, often there's a desire from the tribes to repatriate that or reburial the land into the land and leave it undisturbed, and we can help to provide some of that support. So I think what I'm saying is this is a long-standing problem that we've done a poor job of addressing, but we're doing a much better job. I think California and a few other states, and especially places like Canada, are doing a much better job. They're really leading the way in building these relationships with tribal nations. So it's something we're committed to do. This kind of summarizes some of the facts associated with the reserve system. So we touch about nearly 14,000 students. Through our reservation and management system, we can track all the uses. And so we know exactly how many faculty coming in from what university, whether they're ours or others, how many user days are how many grants and publications are produced. So if you think about this is a big number, $114 million a year in research grants are coming to support the work that's being done. We don't receive that funding. Every campus gets it. The indirect cost rates go back to the campuses. But we are like, for those of you, we're basically a core operating facility for the University of California, is the way we look at it. And we basically charge very little. We don't recover our full cost. But ultimately, it's a very productive system, and it's something that we're super proud of. Something we've done for the last 20 plus years is for most of our sites, we have weather stations, and these weather stations these are scientific grade, and they're calibrated every 2 years. Folks in my office, my central office at the Office of the President, we are responsible for making sure that these are maintained and installed, and then all the data in real time is put into this thing called Dendra Science, which is basically a time series database program. So the data is automated and uplifted through the internet, so we're getting real-time weather. But also, in addition to just the weather monitoring, we have soil moisture probes. We can estimate fuel moisture and temperature. So it's an index of potentially fire risk and things like that. So we have this system already in place. And so the idea I had was, how do we take that and to amplify it? And I keep pushing this button. So in 2020, Governor Newsom signed a proclamation committing California to this 30 by 30 initiative. So 30 by 30 is an initiative to set aside 30% of terrestrial land and coastal waters by 2030 for the state of California. And this is something that is an international effort that's been signed on by many countries, and including the United States through the America Beautiful Act under Biden, but it was canceled under President Trump. And yet California is the fourth largest, if it was a country, it would be the fourth largest economy in the world behind the US, China, and Germany. And California is going its own way. It's creating it's determined to be a sub-national model to show how we can achieve this goal, but also be an example for others to follow. And eventually, we hope that the US will come back on board. But in the meantime, we're plowing ahead. And so this really is the goals that you see on the left-hand side are pretty expansive. You can see that we're still, in California, despite everything, we still believe, in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it means that we've got grants that were canceled and so on, but within the UC Natural Reserve System, it's just core to what we are. California already is a very diverse state. So the idea that we're going to talk about not supporting and promoting the the diversity that exists there would be crazy. So we're into it. It's something we're really committed to do. We're also committed, as I mentioned, to strengthening and doing a better job of tribal engagement. This is a state goal. So in addition to that, there was something called this Appendix D. And by the way, this was a proclamation in 2020, and it became law in 2023. So this isn't just a governor's proclamation that will go away when that governor leaves. This is actually part of state law now. And so there was also a scientific appendix that was written that said, what is the science that we need to help support achieving a 30 by 30? And one of the ideas that people had was to create this climate biodiversity Sentinel Site network, okay? And what that really is in addition to just measuring the weather and the climate, how much biodiversity exists and how do we go about measuring that? And this is something that is not very advanced actually at scale. Lots of work goes on in smaller scales. So what does it mean when you think about 30 by 30? Not all lands are going to be included. There's got to be criteria. And the main criteria is that the land has to be durably protected. Means that it can't ever change its use. So there'll be conservation easements in place, things that create permanent protection. So if you look at that, that means things like wilderness areas, for example. So they're called GAP 1, 2, 3, 4, GAP 1, and then GAP 2 would be things like wildlife refuges and so on. But if you think of other lands, most of the public lands are lands like the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service, for example. These are some of the largest public land holders in America, and yet they're multi-use lands. So you can do mining and timber extraction, recreation, and other things on those lands. So therefore, they're not durably protected for biodiversity, and they don't count in the accounting. So if you look at what counts, it's these two types of lands mapped in here in these different colors. So GAP 1 and 2 lands are the ones that we're really looking at. So it's kind of, as an exercise, what this really is, it's saying if we save 30% of the land and coastal waters, we're going to ultimately protect biodiversity. And that's a great idea, but there's no currently way to know how much biodiversity exists in these lands that they're purchasing and setting aside in this accounting. So at the end of the day, it's a great first step, but there are no baselines from which we can measure our success from. And so that's a flaw in what we're doing. So this is the most recent accounting that just came, July, I think it says it was released. And so the targets are 26% of lands in the dark green, and then you've got these coastal waters, all these little dots around these Channel Islands, for example, all the way up and down the coast. And so I don't have any doubt that we're going to make by 2030, we're going to make our target. I think that's pretty likely. So the question now becomes, what's the quality of the land that we set aside? Is it performing the way that we thought it should? And so on. So how do we do that? What we can do is, these are the questions that I was mentioning. So how do we know that these features represent biodiversity and what type of biodiversity? And then where are the gaps in the representation of the types of land that are being set aside? So we can answer these questions now based on what we know about the land and habitat types. So this is pretty straightforward because you can map it all out. And this just divides up the state into the different ecological regions. So you think of deserts, Sierra Nevada, et cetera. And you can see the biggest piece of types of land that we have, the major habitat types that are accounted, all those lands you saw on that map are deserts and conifer forest, or these pine forest, basically, and shrublands. And that makes up the most of it. And then there's all the other slices of the pie here. So we can use this in a very useful way to say, are we getting close to 30% representation of the different systems that we're trying to protect? And so you can do something like this, and you can map it and say, here's our 30% line, and which of the types of systems are exceeding 30%, which ones are below 30% that need to have more land protected. Of course, there are certain types of lands like marshlands, coastal marshes, for example, where there's such a small amount left, 100% of that needs to be protected. But in the cases like this just gives us a rough index of how we're doing with the land that we're setting aside And it's very useful to do this, but it doesn't really say anything about the actual life that exists in those lands. And that's really what we're after. So this is really what I'm saying up here. I've kind of said it already. If you don't know what you have, you can't set any kinds of targets for knowing whether it's working or it's not working. So we don't have biodiversity targets in California yet. And so here we're talking about creating the Sentinel Sites for Nature, which is really, the key things are here: long-term, standardized, spatially distributed, and integrated in a way that finds indicators that will give us a sense of how we're doing over time. So here it is, like basic questions, like how much biodiversity exists, how's it distributed in space and time. This is where we're talking about creating this baseline. We need a baseline. Everybody does to measure success. We don't have one. You can look at this idea of doing, if you can monitor the environment and biodiversity at big scales, then you can start to do things like modeling. And with the advent of AI, all of these data that we'll be collecting can be ingested. It will help us create models. I can foresee a day when there's some sort of course, sort of like weather forecasting almost, with respect to how nature is doing, how it's progressing over time. And we can look and see, like, how are the climate change that's occurring, and creating these impacts like drought, wildlife, wildfire, et cetera, how are they related to changes in biodiversity or biological processes? And I was saying earlier, forecasting, it could be like an early warning system. You could say these species are at risk of extinction. We need to move in and do some sort of remediation, for example. So the whole idea of this is whatever it is, it's going to be open access. It's going to be available to everyone, from high school students to to policymakers in Washington or beyond, or California, wherever it is. So this will be a very powerful thing if we can establish it. So how are we going to do that? So what we're talking about is a partnership with the University of California. We have 42 sites. 40 of those will be part of the system, at least 40. And then this California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is part of the Natural Resources Agency of the state, has committed 40 sites where they're setting aside these are the gold dots. And they basically have to put instrumentation up. They put weather stations just like ours on all 40 of their sites. And then also we have some private reserves, like the Nature Conservancy is involved, and then these 28 Cal State University System sites that are going to be put out. The funding for all of this, for most of this so far, has come from the California State Cannabis Tax Fund. And so basically the taxes collected are made to the government has, and they're giving them out as grants. Because the interest initially was to set up a protocol that would help to assess biodiversity near where cannabis cultivation was occurring. So that was the logic. And then they turned to us as we were partnering together on other issues, and we were friends. They said, we'd like to show that methodology can be taken to scale, and would you like to try to deploy this at your 40 of your sites? And so this led to this whole concept of going to scale. We got $2 million earlier this year. The CSU's got $2 million to do the same. So we have the funding to stand this up, and the goal is to be able to monitor biodiversity in the same way at all of these sites for a 10-week period every year in the spring, and then demonstrate that the data can be placed in the correct repositories, and I'll show you what that means, and then be accessible for analysis in the future. So this is a big system. It's a challenge. If you're interested, you could look at that QR code it sets up, shows you the protocols and how they get set up. So, biodiversity reflects a lot of different elements, so we're really focusing on terrestrial vertebrates right now. So this is a proof of concept. We're basically building an ecological instrument, if you think of it that way. If you put a satellite up into space and the government pays for that, scientists at universities around the world write grants to see to have that telescope aimed at a particular part of the universe. Well, we're creating this ecological instrument where, once established, anybody can come along and put different instruments or additional monitoring devices. So it's meant to be flexible and nimble and adaptable over time, so we can take advantage of new technologies. You're probably all familiar with things like camera traps They're very common. These are acoustic recording units. They're these small little devices that measure sound, and they can collect data at different frequencies. And so we're using these to detect bat sounds and bird sounds. And then we have our weather station, and then we have something called a MODIS tower. And this looks like an old-fashioned TV antenna or something. This is a tower where birds that are outfitted with little tags, as they fly by, they're being passively pinging the system, and it's detecting, so we can identify bird migratory patterns as they're coming through as well. So these are the things we're looking at. This is a drift net fence and with a camera trap in it, this little box. I'm going to show you what that looks like and how it works. So this is, if you're out, this drift net, it's just kind of the stuff you would see along a highway to prevent erosion control, for example. But it's been structured in such a way that an animal, let's say a small rodent or a snake or anything, would come along here, and it would get down. It might get down to the bottom and have to turn around. This makes it turn around and go back in the other direction. Ultimately, it's directed into this little box. And by the way, these boxes are constructed to be quite light, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife folks, they backpack all this stuff in each season, and they set it up, and then they leave it for 10 weeks, and they come back and they pull the SD cards out of the cameras and out of the recorders. They bring it back to the lab, and they upload it into the cloud, into different data analysis AI programs, for example. So that's very time consuming. I'll get to that in a minute, how we're going to get around that. But when it comes through the box, there's a camera that's facing downward, a downward facing camera. And these are the types of images you get. So you have a ruler in there, and you get everything from skunks and snakes and rodents and so on. And these are the types of images that we will collect. So this is what this DriftNet system is. So one of the cameras is a downward facing camera, like that. A second camera is one that's put on a pole or a tree, just like you see these other wildlife cameras that you might be familiar with. Those are detecting larger species like these that are depicted here. So these would be typical wildlife cameras, the types of species that you would see in California, including humans or even cows sometimes, mountain lions. So this is one, that's the second. So these are all real images that were collected by our colleagues there in California. And so ultimately what you're doing is you're taking that drift net fence setup with the downward facing camera, a regular wildlife camera, 2 acoustic recorders, and that's one monitoring location. So for each weather station with a rain gauge and stuff here, within 500 meters, you place 4 of these monitoring stations on a particular property, and each one of the monitoring locations is a location that represents a slightly different ecosystem type, perhaps, or a variable site on each property. So this is the setup. So if you take this setup and you multiply it times about 120, and that's what we're going to be monitoring all simultaneously. I was trying to do the math earlier. It's something like 8 times 120 is almost 1,000 cameras and acoustic monitors that are going to be monitoring simultaneously. That's a tremendous amount of work. It's the largest system of its kind that we're aware of. But going out and collecting those cards and stuff is very labor intensive, and it's not going to work in the long run. It just costs too much. And so to take this to scale, we're going to have to take advantage of AI. And so we've already done this. One of my colleagues on my team devised a system here where, say for example, you see a little vole, maybe it's in a downward facing camera. This type of, they call it edge computing. It's basically a solar powered single board computer that's in the field that's been trained on AI and to basically identify photographs, and it's so hundreds of thousands of images, and so it can detect a vole, and what it'll do is it'll process that. It'll instead of uploading a photograph, which takes a massive amount of data and would never be able to be uploaded easily, be too costly and too slow, it translates it into kind of like basically a text message. And it gives you the date and the time stamp. It tells you the species, and this is the confidence interval that we think that it's being detected at. It makes it into this little text message and uploads it to a satellite. And so this swarm system is no longer, it's been debunked by, anyway, but we've got other satellite systems that can be used. But the idea here is you're collecting data in near real time. Later, you can go get the cards and you can get the reference data and you can run it through the systems if you want to check things. But this may be good enough for what we're trying to look at in terms of frequency detection, absence, presence, absence kind of modeling. As we did this, we found out that Microsoft AI for Good has also just come out. So this is a pretty common. I think people are all converging on the need to do this type of work. So this is something called Sparrow, and it's kind of like a central processing unit that links to these different devices, like I've just mentioned. And so it will take those data and also uplift them to a satellite. That's being done in collaboration with NASA Ames, which we have a good partnership developing with too. And there's even another camera that just came out, Sentinel cameras, for example. Our thing is not, we already developed our own system, but we're sort of agnostic about which methodology or which technique is going to be the one we use, because at the end of the day, techniques are going to evolve, and things are going to get cheaper and going to get better. And so we don't want to really be reliant on one particular type of instrument. The idea is we want to get those images translated into something meaningful and uplifted in near real time. So we're going to be trying this method, and so we're pretty excited about having that. So, I told you we were really measuring just vertebrate species, and so that's what we're doing. But here is another thing, insect monitoring. So that's part of biodiversity, and maybe one of the largest parts of biodiversity other than microbial diversity. We don't even have any idea at this time how many different species of insects exist in California, for example. Millions, likely, that we've never characterized. And so this was in this system, this is called a malaise trap. And in that case, you would have this net with a UV light, and you'd have a jar or something that could collect the insects inside. They fall in the trap, and they're killed, and you take them out, and you could spread them out, in this case on a plate, and then you use this device, this robot, which would take a high-resolution camera and train with AI, and what it does is the red circles means it's too close to something, but anything with a green circle meant it could be analyzed, and then it would analyze these images using this high multispectral kind of imagery production, and it would look for specific parts of the body that would be important to detect for an individual species. And so from this, you kind of train an AI system to detect insects. That, in this case, you still are going to collect them the old-fashioned way. They're going to be killed, and you're going to measure them. So we're doing something across our whole system right now. It's not currently part of officially the Sentinel Sites for Nature, but we're also doing this type of malaise trapping. We're sending samples to a lab. They put it in these 96 well plates, and they take a photographic image of each individual insect, and then out of the alcohol that's in that little well that it's in, they look at, they do barcoding, a type of DNA analysis. And so we're doing that now, and that's sort of going to be maybe the reference collection way to do things, but it's too expensive and too time consuming for us to do it over time. So now this is just emergent. So this is a new methodology. You see, you got the screen here with a UV light coming out, a high resolution camera here connected to a solar powered computer that's trained on AI. And the bugs are coming to the light, and as they're flying in front of the panel, the camera is detecting individual insects and it's identifying them in real time. And that data is also then can be uploaded into a data stream. So here we're getting out of this idea of having to do all this manual labor. You maybe still have to do that in the beginning to sort of validate things, cross-reference things, but this is an incredible tool. So we'll be adding something like this to our system as well. So again, it's an instrument that it's a platform basically we add new instruments to as we go, and this is definitely one we're going to be trying out as we move forward soon. So if you think about additional things that we can be doing, we will be doing. We're working with NASA, and they have these. They do flyovers, and they have spectrographs that look at the multispectral imagery of basically through different light spectra. And they can look at different ecosystems and help you characterize in pretty good detail from space what's going on Earth. And this would be, you could use LiDAR to characterize three-dimensional structure of plants and forest. And this is something called, it's a vegetation index. This shows the way that from space, the way the image looks different pre-fire. This is after a fire, and then it had a year, 2 years, and had another fire. So you can look at, using the satellite imagery, you can detect a change in the greenness, so a loss of vegetation. This stuff is not recovering as well as it was here. So in addition, so we can look at this over time. We can assess biodiversity and how it responds. So when you have a fire, what's lost? What species are going to recover? And so these are the things that we don't yet know, and that's what we're trying to get to, is to be very practical. Up here, we've probably heard of community science work. That's things like iNaturalist or eBird, these kinds of things where citizens go out, they take an image, and they share that data. And these are very powerful platforms. We have things like there's iNaturalist here. These are observations of iNaturalist looking at different species. You can see it's very densely populated in some areas. Things like there's a breeding bird survey that goes out where citizen scientists go out each year and do surveys, the Christmas bird count, and things like eBird. So these are observations that we can overlay with the types of data that we're collecting. In the same way, we have eDNA, so environmental DNA, where you could take, these days you can even collect air samples, water samples, soil samples. You run them through basically a sequencer, and you can identify species in that way. So we'll be using eDNA. We're already characterizing a lot of our reserves using that. And then whole genome sequencing, which can help tell you a lot about basically what species are there, but also looking at genetic diversity and how species are doing at a genetic level. So I hope you get the idea that in addition to the vertebrate species, we're layering on all kinds of new information that will really give us a comprehensive assessment of what's going on. So when you get these data, they come in through the camera traps and they're uploaded. The idea is to, they go into different platforms, so different, they call them data repositories or AI machine learning repositories. So all the photographs go into something called Wildlife Insights. All the bat recordings go into NA-BAT. All the birds go into Wildlife Sound Hub. Weather data into Dendra. All the bird flying data goes into the MODIS database. All of those data then can be accessed through, we're using the San Diego Supercomputer Center, providing us with storage and something called the National Data Platform, with the idea that usually when you want to take something from the cloud, you pay a cost when it comes down, and when you upload it back, and it can be very expensive if you're manipulating big data sets. So the idea is to get out of reliance on things like Amazon Web Service or whatever, and using this national data platform. So the data can be, you could inquire about a particular georeferenced set of sites, and you could ask it for all the photographic and audio imagery that you have, and then you can cache it and you can store it in a place where you can work on it until you're done. And then so it becomes a way for accessibility to be enhanced. Number one thing is we want to make it accessible to everybody. And so this is a method for doing that. And it's no small task. And when you hear about things like data science, artificial intelligence, collecting the data is the easy part, honestly. It's going to be how are we going to make sense of all of that data, massive amounts of data that can be, how are we going to synthesize it into kind of products that can be digestible by people and legislators who have to make decisions, for example. So this is how it will probably work. We hope that it'll work. And I just wanted to reinforce the point that when we talk about biodiversity, we're not just talking about plants and animals. We're talking about fungi, bacteria, and I didn't even talk about plants, but a lot of that can be done with satellite imagery and on-the-ground vegetation studies using things like phenocams, which are taking pictures of habitats over time. So these are things that we're moving towards. This is really, if we're successful, it'll be the largest biodiversity monitoring platform of its kind, and we're going to be increasing, like for example, we'll be measuring and mapping all the fungi and bacteria in the state of California, essentially, at least in terms of like regional mapping. So it's a pretty comprehensive set. I just wanted to really finish by saying that, when we, in a day and age that we're in today, having lands that are set aside for this type of work are more important than ever before. And honestly, what we're talking about when we think about this is we're trying to sustain biodiversity and really stand up nature for the benefit of all of us. And if we don't have that understanding, then we can't make good decisions for how we manage those resources for our benefit. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you. All right.
That's pretty crazy, actually. Questions for Dr. Monfort?
A veterinarian, by the way.
Yes, he's also a veterinarian.
My dog is there. So I was going to ask about the funding, but the cannabis thing is really interesting. That makes me want to never do it. Like, what are full use of that fund?
Yeah.
What's the biggest challenge you're facing right now, trying to manage all of these? Like the machine learning is so cool, and it seems like you've actually got a lot more of the protocols and data stream stuff figured out. What's your biggest challenge that you're facing?
To be honest, the biggest challenge is sort of creating a multi-jurisdictional governance framework. So we don't exist as a legal entity, as one body, and so currently it's just a partnership amongst, and so you can see it's a massive partnership, but it's all held together essentially by, these professional relationships. It's not, we don't have legal agreements with each other, and this is something we're going to have to address probably going forward, because ultimately, if we're going to sign agreements with someone or receive funding from someplace, we have to have a legal entity. Otherwise, one of us has to be kind of the fiscal partner. So I think we're a startup in a kind of collaborative way. But if this is successful, it's going to end up having to be owned by and managed by the state of California or some sort of private, perhaps a little not-for-profit that's set up to receive funding, distribute it, and be kind of the fiscal agent. I think that's one of the biggest problems. The rest of it is just, right now, it's just logistics. So we got the money and then rolling this out, hiring the staff, putting the instruments out, and then getting set up so that we can all in concert start the monitoring at the same time. So probably we think in 26, not all 110 or 20 are going to be ready, but we already have the cannabis team at CDFW has already data. So we'll probably have, I'm hoping half of those might be up in 2026, and maybe all of them by 2027. So I think we're really, we have enough funding. My team, what I did is to say, we're going to stand this up, but if we get no more money, I want to be able to continue maintaining this as part of our baseline operations. Because I have a small number of staff, not many, at each of these sites, and so they could go out and collect and make sure that the equipment is, it's malfunctioning or something. So we're feeling like the University of California can be the stable backbone of this entire thing, whereas the state, they're going out and deploying these for 10 weeks and then taking them down and then coming back next year. So that'll be kind of the pulse of everybody doing the work, and then ours will be continuous. So we don't know whether yet continuous monitoring is needed or whether the 10-week monitoring will give us the same. So we can sort of say, what's it look like if you do 10 weeks versus if you do a year round? It may be that we don't need to do more than 10, or it may be that 10 weeks is insufficient. Over here?
As a vet to a hopefully future vet, what would you say is one of the more important things I should have before applying?
Experience. You need to get experience, and that just means like going out and getting practical experience working with a veterinarian, getting your hands on and deciding whether it's something you really truly like when you see what it's like to be a vet. I get this question, even I was answering it earlier today. I wanted to be a vet for very, kind of emotional reasons. I love nature and animals and so forth. But it wasn't until I actually got in the situation where I was working side by side with another veterinarian to see what it was like. I wanted to, and I really paid attention to that person and how they acted, and did they love it? Were they inspiring to me? I mean, did they feel it was something I could do for 30 or 40 years? I really feel like that's it. That's the most, finding a mentor, somebody that can be a guide for you and help advise you as you go is super important too. I said that to almost every student I met with. It's like the most important thing you can do is find a mentor. We all have one. We all need, if you don't have one, you need one. We all need somebody to help guide us, to validate our interest. So to me, that's the most powerful thing you can do. Just get in there, get to work, try to, you have to volunteer, and just find out whether it's really for you or not. Because sometimes the reality of it can be different than kind of what you think about, in your brain. So get experience. That's for everything that people are doing at your stage of life. That's really what it's about. That's why I say getting out into the field. There's no substitute for that because it'll help you decide, yeah, I love this, or man, I can't stand this, or whatever. You need to make those decisions, right or wrong, for what's right for you. And you can't do that without real life experience. So I think experiential learning, that's what I would say. Yeah. Anybody?
Other questions? Comments? So I have a question. I have a lot of questions, but so I was really impressed about the drift fence, and thinking about how to convert, methodologies that we've used for decades and advancing it to kind of this non-invasive and this technology-based. And so you still have the same, the animals are going to be funneled in this way, but instead of going into these pitfalls and buckets and all of these things, like they're getting the images taken and then we're moving on. Is there somebody who just sits around and is like, oh, this is what we're going to do? Or is there a team collaborative effort of saying, how can we monitor this in the best way, most non-invasive way, something that's not time-consuming or economically draining? I mean, how did you come up with those individual protocols?
Yeah, the protocol we're following was established by the CDFW cannabis folks who were initiating the studies on cannabis cultivation. And so in order for us, the whole idea for us to receive the money was to replicate their model. So this has been implemented in the field for 2 years. So we already know they've collected data, they know the system works well, and it was something that I think is a trade-off really between something that's economical. I mean, this whole system doesn't cost very much at all, other than a couple of $1,000 to put the whole thing up for the recorders and everything. And we have, in our case, the state has a big contract with Wildlife Insights, and so we don't have to come up with additional funding for that. So I think there's no probably perfect system, but the idea is everybody has to be the same, and the protocol has to be uniform. I think this is because someone else did it, and that's how we got the money. So we committed to do this protocol, and but I think outside of the drip net and the cameras, so many other kinds of sensors are going to be able to be used. We're thinking about monitoring for microplastics and water quality and air quality and sound pollution and smoke, signals and so forth. So it's just going to be, I don't think that after the baseline protocol, I think right now it's still undetermined as to whether there's going to be more standardized methodology or whether folks will just add instruments that they want to do for their own purposes. I'm not really sure yet. I think this is just this is pretty overwhelming in a way, to just govern this and to guide it through to implementation. So, I mean, that's really what we're focusing on now, is get everybody to row in the same direction using the same methodology, because we think that's the proof of concept. Can we all simultaneously measure the same thing, the same way, the same databases, at the same time? That would be something that nobody's ever done. So that's the first step. Much more to come after that, though. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you a question about your ARES program? Is that the acronym you call ARES, E-R-E-S? Or?
Oh, ARES, yeah.
ARES.
Yeah.
So I'm a student, right? Doing my hairline or whatever.
Yeah.
And I just don't like to go outside. My experience going outside is not a positive one. Do I have to participate in this program? How do they engage me kind of in this program, or do you kind of have options for me to opt out? How do you convince me?
Yeah.
Or how do you convince me that's
useful? I wasn't involved in the students who got selected in the program on that end of it. But I mean, the whole premise of it is that you are going to go out in nature. You're going to do it overnights. You're going to collect data, and you're going to be in the field. And so that's an upfront thing. So you have to decide whether you're in or out based on that. What we did here is we formed a partnership with UC Santa Barbara community colleges in that area, and we then basically created a cohort that consisted of not just community college students, but also some CSU students and others. And then basically we wanted to utilize our reserves as that opportunity. So in our case, mostly went to Santa Cruz Island, which is a cool place. I mean, it's off the shore of Ventura, and it's this unbelievable, untouched island that's been restored. And so the idea is they go to our field station, they spend time there, they're together collectively, and then the data and stuff that they collect, they bring it back. We have a data science program that they can participate in. That's a separate kind of a module. But ultimately, it's a continuum. They're tracked and followed. They participate in mentoring events and as they go along. So it's something like the students are tracked through the time that they start at community college into the UC. So they're really, there's a lot of investment in their time, and the cohort, comes together repeatedly and builds bonds and relationships. And I think that's really a key to it. It's fun for the kids, and it creates a community, really their own sort of community of practice, and it's a pretty powerful thing to see. In fact, the woman, Cristina Soto-Valderas, 8 years ago, she participated in the very first cohort, and now she's my education director for the entire UC reserve system. She transferred from Santa Barbara City College to UC Santa Barbara. She became a math major. She got into a PhD program. She's doing a math PhD in evaluation, and she works for me. And she came from she's a DACA recipient. She originally, and she's so she's somebody who the kind of student we want to reach are the ones that haven't had these opportunities in the past, who might be too intimidated to jump from a community college into a UC. It's a scary thing. It was scary for me, when I was going to it. So the idea is to want to break it down. We don't want to make nature feel like it's exclusionary or it's intimidating, and we don't want to be intimidating either. And when you get into the field, that a lot of those barriers break down. You start seeing somebody differently and get to know them a little bit, and you don't feel you don't feel intimidated to give them a call and ask for their advice and things like that. So in many ways, it's really a mentoring program, but it's based on building agency and competence in science. So it's really the students that come into the program are STEM students that are transfer intended. So they already know that they want to try to go to a UC. So that's kind of a pre-criteria for selection. So it's called the MESA program in the Santa Barbara area.
All right, I know we're obviously past 5:30, and the high school bus is waiting for them, and some other students are hungry. So I'm going to end it there. But for those of you who have further questions or interests or different things, let me know. We can reach out to Dr. Munford at any point in time. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. And thank you, Richmond Community High School students. I hope we see you again.
Thank you.